It takes a lot of good staff support, and I want to say something about that in a second. And then it takes, some judgments that, in some ways you're really just saying to council, well, look, you guys need to look at this more thoroughly, and you need to figure out how to put it out there so that the voters can understand it, right? And that probably needs more time rather than less, right? It means more deliberative process rather than less, and it needs to happen more frequently in order to simply not be playing catch-up constantly. One thing that made it possible for us to do this, and nobody's mentioned it, is that we had terrific support from the law department in this process. Rick Horvath, who's sitting in the back of the room, people should know this because it was a very, very detailed, time-consuming process that Rick carried off. Hey, Chief Corporation Counsel, is that your title? Right. But what it really was is, charter wizard. So, and you got to have that role in the process. When in the '88 process, that role was really carried by staff people from the old Citizens League, and they were pretty good at it. But the old Citizens League no longer exists, and that says something about the history of this process, I think. I mean, my understanding, and I wasn't here at the time, is that when this was originally put into the charter, the process of charter review, it was really put in at the behest of the Citizens League, which was at that point a pretty effective presence in the city, and the idea was really that the good government forces of the citizenry were going to have a shot, at kind of going and figuring out what should be done to make this whole thing work better and more fairly, and there'd be some pressure on council once that had happened, to put the stuff on the ballot. Well, things have changed, constituencies have changed, the array of forces have changed in the city, and we probably really need to look at, who was ready to put that kind of support in this time was the city government itself, right? So we need to recognize that reality and think about how to change things so that this modernization will work. We're not going to get to 116 changes, I don't think, anytime in the next 5 years, right? Despite the best efforts of the legislation committee, this is, if we get through however many it is, 26 this fall, it's going to be quite an accomplishment of public debate and discussion. So Matt asked me to talk about that subject, which I understand because I think it's important for people, just in terms of understanding the review process, to understand also that it is a process, that it's not something that just happens and then it's over with. If it just happens and then it's over with, most of the time we spent will have been wasted.
Bill Callahan, thank you. My first question has to do with one of the more controversial parts of the proposals laid out, which is the reduction of council. And I have to apologize in advance. As a journalist, we're taught to approach anything government does with a good dose of skepticism. So I'm going to put my first question to Councilwoman Cleveland. Under the reduction proposal, there will be fewer council people representing a larger number of constituents. And I think that it can be seen as lessening waste, and it can also be seen as lessening access to government. And I guess if you could sort of begin by talking about the discussions you've had and sort of needing to find the right balance.
Well, let me say, for the record, although I voted to put this amendment issue on the ballot, personally, I'm opposed to council reduction in this particular amendment. I lean towards the side of this is a move to lessen access to government for the people in the city of Cleveland, particularly at a time when the city's undergoing a number of difficult issues. We have, high poverty issues, education, unemployment. The city finances, accordingly, are negatively impacted. We've got the foreclosure crisis and the burgeoning, well, not even burgeoning, but the enormous vacant and abandoned housing situation in our cities, where we don't even know, we're still in the middle of it. Like Hurricane Ike, and we don't know where we're going to end up once it's over. So we've got a number of things going on in the city right now, and I think just to decrease the number of council people, I don't think it decreases waste or it doesn't save money, because because each council person would need to have more staff people to deal with the number of issues that are going on. We have less people, but we have the same number of issues going on, or greater issues going on now. We still have the same amount of territory in the city of Cleveland. You may have a fewer number of people, but the square footage of the city hasn't changed, and the number of buildings, the number of properties, the amount of land, none of that has changed. So, and also, I think it's a move towards really making it more difficult for people to interact with their government. I think at City Council and the City of Cleveland in particular, this is the form of government that people have and that we're used to. And council people in Cleveland we're legislators and we do policy, but we're also advocates and much more to the people in our city, and that has evolved over years, with the formation of our government. And I think to look at just reducing numbers doesn't really address, the issues of, whether we need to reform the government or change the structure. It's not just a matter of numbers. I think it's something that requires, a lot more thought and a lot more discussion. So, again, I think I like to say that, city council government is really government at the eyeball level. I see my constituents in the grocery store. I walk down the street with them every day. I drive by their homes, their schools. I'm there in the neighborhood. People come to my house. They come to my door. I'm not in Columbus 3 times a week. I'm not in Washington 3 times a week and home on the weekends. It's a very different situation, what we have here in the city of Cleveland. And I think, the forces that have brought this issue to the table, the majority of whom are not Cleveland residents, are not really looking at what's in the best interest of the people in the city, and they have other interests. And personally, again, I'm just, my personal opinion, I put it on the record because I voted to put it on the record because I think the people in the city need the opportunity to vote and make their voice heard. And certainly, if the people vote for it, then it's the will of the people, and I accept that. But I think this is a situation when we're looking at people proposing regionalism and changes in county government. There's a real in-depth discussion that needs to take place, and where that's going to end up. So,
does Mr. Silversten or Mr. Callahan feel differently about the idea of council reduction?
Well, let me talk a little bit about the proposal itself. My basic, personal opinion is pretty similar to Councilwoman Cleveland's. The truth is that the proposal that council put on the ballot in most respects is, however, something that a large majority of the commission recommended, and that was despite the fact that there were people who wanted something smaller and people who wanted something, really didn't see a strong argument for changing the situation at all. And I think there was a pretty clear consensus that there needed to be a proposal made because of the political situation, because the issue was one that was ripe for a serious kind of public decision. Right? However, people came down on the substance of it. The proposal, as I think everybody knows, was originally put on the table by the council president, and the council president basically said, "Don't fix a number, fix a population." Right? Let's just pick a number that we think is practical for a ward representation system, and then tie the number of council members to that number. And the number that he proposed is 25,000, and that's the number that we ultimately recommended, and it's the number that's on the ballot. So you're going to find people from the commission and from other places who are unhappy with that proposal from both directions, but what the council put on the ballot was what the large majority of the commission recommended. Most of us did, for whatever motive we had. The one thing I do want to make the point is that we did not recommend that it apply next year. There was a separate vote on the question of whether we should try to implement this change next year, and by a 7-6 vote, the commission voted against that. So that part of what the council has put on the ballot is not a commission recommendation. And there are arguments about that which I won't waste your time with now, but they basically have to do with whether there's any data to do the redistricting.